Welcome to the Town of Jupiter, Jupiter U Open Space Tour. We are beginning our tour here today at Jones Creek Hammock, which is a natural area that we've owned since about 1987. It was incorporated into the open space program after the bond referendum in 2004. This property is located on the corner of Tony Penna and South Pennock Lane. It's also the location of the North County Aquatic Center. The natural area comprises just over 18 acres and has 4 different habitat types. We've got pine flatwoods, cypress slough, mangrove swamp, and of course the namesake, oak hammock. So come on, let's check it out. So here we are. We've just entered Jones Creek Hammock on the walking path. We are entering the pine flatwoods portion of the property. This habitat type, as you can see, consists of many pine trees in the overstory, and the understory has lots of saw palmetto and myrcene, lots of other vegetation. You can see there's lots of native grapevine. There's some oak scattered throughout, but largely it's pine and saw palmetto. Now, an interesting thing about this habitat type is it, under totally natural conditions, regenerates and regrows with a fire cycle. So what that means is lightning will strike under natural circumstances and hit a tree or the ground even and start a small fire. And what that does is burn through the saw palmetto to expose the bare mineral soil and allows for new regrowth of grasses and other vegetation that will eventually transition back into the more woody material, including the saw palmetto. And this also helps the pines regenerate. Pines of this nature have cones that are full of sap. They are called serotinous cones, and the fire helps the sap loosen up and the cone open up to allow the seeds to drop onto the newly exposed bare mineral soil, thus allowing the pine cone seeds to germinate and grow new pine trees. Now here in this natural area, since we are in close proximity to residential areas, we do not participate in fire management, but we are investigating the possibility of using mechanical management, which would mimic a natural fire cycle in this habitat type.
We're entering the portion of Jones Creek Hammock that is actually the namesake habitat, oak hammock. Oak hammocks are dominated by 2 different types of oaks in South Florida, laurel oaks and live oaks. The understory usually consists of plants such as saw palmetto, myrcene. It's not a fire-dominated or fire-maintained type of community like pine flatwoods, but occasionally fires do sweep through and wipe out the understory, cleaning the area up and creating better habitat. Now we're coming up to one of my favorite parts of this preserve area, the cypress slough. As you can see, there are some large cypress trees growing in this area. Some people estimate that these trees might be up to 300 plus years old. It's amazing to me too that when this area was developed that they weren't cleared or cut down. You can see there's a lot of different types of plants in this area. This is where Jones Creek turns from a freshwater slough, a freshwater swamp system, and begins to transition into a mangrove ecosystem. Right now, we're standing at the northwest corner of Jones Creek Hammock. This is the area where the creek transitions to more of a saltwater system and begins its flow into the Loxahatchee River. As you can see, there's a weir here which was constructed with the intent of preventing saltwater intrusion back into the freshwater portion of the system. Now, generally speaking, it's been pretty effective, but this area can be a little bit brackish sometimes, which is why you see the mangroves in an area that typically would be filled with freshwater species. Now, one of the things we want to show you as we go through these different open space properties and different preserve areas, they may seem like scattered pockets of preservation throughout the town, but the reality is they're part of a much larger ecosystem. This entire area, this flow that you see coming over the weir here, begins at the Jones Creek Headwaters Preserve, which is on Military Trail just across the street from the entrance to the Botanica neighborhood. Historically, that area was the beginning of the watershed, where all of the water collected and began to flow towards this area of Jones Creek into the Loxahatchee River. Jones Creek Headwaters Preserve is a mixture of pine flatwoods, freshwater maple swamp. It's interconnected into the preserve area for the Paseos development. So what we've tried to do through the establishment of these different preserve areas is provide some additional protection to all of the systems that feed into the Loxahatchee River, which is designated wild and scenic at the federal level. As you know, water flows downhill. It begins to collect from rainwater in the Jones Creek Headwaters Preserve, flows through the Paseos Preserve into Jones Creek Hammock, across this weir, into Jones Creek, which then flows by our Todd Street Preserve, where the water enters the estuarine system and begins to flow past our Jones Creek Preserve, which is located on Indiantown Road, and on into the Loxahatchee River. Now, there are two types of mangroves that populate this area, the red mangrove and the white mangrove. If you've ever seen mangroves out along the water, you'll notice those large spider-like prop roots that come out and anchor the mangrove into the subsurface of the water. That is the red mangrove, and they're very obvious. It's easy to tell them apart from other mangroves because of those roots, but if you can't see the roots, like we have some of those here, if you can't see the roots, you can tell the red mangrove by the leaf. The leaf is a dark glossy green. It typically has a pointed tip and a lighter colored underside. The other mangrove in this area is the white mangrove. The white mangroves have a very oval-shaped leaf, and if you look down at the base of the leaf where Gretchen's pointing, you can see two glands on either side at the base of the leaf. That is an identifying characteristic of the white mangrove. The white mangrove does not have prop roots. It's a single trunk or a multi-trunk tree with light-colored bark. The red mangroves typically have bark that's a little bit smoother.
Welcome to the Todd Street Mangrove Preserve, aptly named for its location on Todd Street. The very tall trees you see are actually mangroves, probably 35 feet tall or so. We do have a couple other trees and palms in here. We've got some laurel oaks out front. We have a cabbage palm, but generally all of the very tall stuff in the back are different mangroves, white mangroves, red mangroves. You can see their prop roots. Now, an interesting thing about this property is when we acquired it, it was so full of invasive exotics, you couldn't even see those tall mangrove trees, because all in front were many Brazilian pepper plants. We embarked on a massive invasive exotic removal project last year, which was followed by the replanting of the upland area, the small upland area on a portion of the property, which was replanted with all types of native trees, palms, shrubs, and ground cover.
Well, here we are at the upland portion of the Todd Street Mangrove Preserve. Not a very large area, but it is a significant area as it can provide quite a bit of habitat for birds. Neighbors across the street have told us that for a number of winters they saw painted buntings coming here every year during their annual migration. When we first purchased this property, It was full of Brazilian pepper and melaleuca, which are two of the most invasive of the exotic species that plague South Florida natural areas. It took us a few years, but we were finally able to get a plan in place to remove all of the exotics and replant the area with native plants. Now, the exotics had gotten so thick in here that the only way you could reach the water just ahead of us was basically walking through a tunnel of Brazilian pepper. When Hurricane Irma passed, the Brazilian pepper collapsed, making it almost impossible to walk onto this portion of the property and to get to the water. As you can see, it's quite a different story now. We tried to use a number of different native plants, shrubs, and trees that would be useful food sources for the local wildlife. I'll show you a few of those now. This shrub here is used in landscaping quite a bit, but it is also a native shrub that provides food sources for local wildlife. It's the cocoa plum. You can see some of the plums actually beginning to grow on the branches of the shrub. Another favorite is firebush. This is one of the premier butterfly plants that people use in South Florida in native plantings. We also have Simpson's stopper and wild coffee. Now, I wouldn't really go harvesting the beans and try to make a drinkable coffee out of it, but it definitely does look like the coffee plant when it's full of the red berries. Over here is more of a saltwater marsh area. This grass is called spartina. It's a grass that can grow in saltwater, brackish, or freshwater areas. You often find it along salt marshes. And then as we get a little bit closer to the mangroves, we can actually see through the mangroves and get a glimpse of Jones Creek. This is a natural creek. This is on the natural section of the creek. And that entire Jones Creek watershed, beginning up by Military Trail, feeds fresh water into this system. That's why it's so important for us as a town to have this open space program where we can purchase properties that abut some of these amazing natural resources that run right through the middle of our town and protect them. And as we protect those resources, we have an opportunity to clean up the water, to continue protecting the Loxahatchee River.